So without further ado, let's get started with our first talk on forest bathing and nature therapy from Shirley Gleeson. So Shirley is a nature and well-being consultant and director of the Eco Wellness Consulting and the Forest Therapy Institute. She holds master's degrees in both health promotion and social work and has over 20 years' experience working in the areas of mental health and social care in Ireland. She designs nature-based interventions to improve people's well-being and facilitates training for mental health professionals. She has extensive postgraduate training in expressive arts therapy, ecotherapy, counselling, therapeutic play, dialectical behavioural therapy skills, behavioural family therapy, and the therapeutic use of mindfulness. Shirley is an international expert on forest therapy and has presented her research at conferences in Ireland, the UK, Austria, Switzerland, and Greece, and has addressed the United Nations on the topic of human health in forests. You can learn more about her work at www.ecowellnessconsulting.com. So, Shirley, whenever you're ready, let's just get started, and I'm really looking forward to this.
Great. Thank you so much, Niall, for that introduction. And I'm just seeing some people saying good morning in the chat room. So Michaela, hi, Carl, Roisin, Claire, Sammy, good morning. Very excited for this, Monica. Sometimes it's a little bit strange when you feel like you're talking to yourself on the screen. So the chat box is really interesting just for engagement. So just welcome everybody to today's session on nature-based forest bathing and nature and forest therapy. I'm just going to start presentation. So I'm Shirley, and as Niall mentioned, I'm a nature and wellbeing consultant. I'm based in Dublin, on the border between Dublin and Wicklow. So I think I've got the best of all worlds. I live just around 5 minutes from the sea. We have some beautiful forests and gardens close by, and we're not too far from the city centre in Dublin. So for me, it's an ideal place to live in terms of landscape. So I'll just say a little bit, as Niall has introduced me in terms of myself. I suppose you can see the three circles there. The three most important things, I suppose, in my life really are nature, health, and society, and how they interconnect. I was always interested, when I left school, I was always interested in social science and working with groups of people, but I was also interested in biology and the natural world. And I never saw how the two of them could fit together up until about 10 years ago, when I started to explore different nature-based practices. And I have to say, Ireland, sometimes we're a little bit behind other countries in terms of embracing, innovative practice. So for a number of years, it was quite isolating for me in terms of my nature-based work. I was telling people what I was doing. They didn't really get it. They didn't understand the different dimensions. But I think now people really are starting to see the importance of nature-based interventions and nature-based work. So that would be the umbrella term in terms of forest bathing and forest therapy, nature therapy. So I did some training. My background is in social work, spent a lot of time in mental health, child and adolescent and adult. But right throughout my career, I did different trainings in South Africa. I trained as a nature guide there, which was magical. And I went to the States in 2014, and that's where I trained in forest therapy. So I was the very first European to be trained, and now they've trained forest therapy practitioners, I think, in over 35 countries. So just wanted to say a little bit about what to expect for the talk today. I think you would have been given my slides, so you might have the handouts there. We're going to have a look at the definitions and development of forest therapy international. It's a relatively new area, and there's a lot of different definitions and approaches to this practice. So I think it's really important that I can give you an outline of what the field is like at the moment. I'm going to look at the different components of forest therapy. So what you might see is that a lot of the literature uses the terms forest bathing, Shinrin-yoku, and forest therapy interchangeably. But for me and the work we do at the Forest Therapy Institute, we separate it out. So I'll be talking a little bit more about that. Also, some theories on nature and health that's relevant to the practice. So to really embed this work with a strong theoretical framework. Looking a little bit about the evidence base, because again, I suppose anything we do, we have to demonstrate that there's an evidence base behind it. But to really look at this as an emerging evidence base, because it's still such a young practice. Also, I designed and delivered and evaluated a 6-week forest therapy intervention, which we're just about to get published. So I can go through that with you just to see what it looks like. Also, in terms of assessment criteria, who is suitable for forest therapy intervention, because not everybody is working with clinical populations, specifically mental health. Working with different mental health diagnosis, from mild to severe, and also the challenges working outdoors and site selection. So it's quite, as you can see, it's quite a practical. I cover a lot of theory, evidence, and practice. I'm also going to use a little bit of video throughout this talk, because I know 2 hours can be quite a long time to hold your attention. And also, I'm going to use the chat box on occasion, and we're going to have, I think, 4 different polls. So it's going to be quite an interactive section, or an interaction session. So, just going to ask again, how do trees support your health? So if you think about your own lives, maybe if you wanted to put in the chat box, maybe a word or a couple of words about how trees support your own health, whether your physical health, mental health, social well-being, what does that look like? Grounding, okay, bringing peace, oxygen, something bigger than us, perspective, connection, add beauty, spiritual health, multisensory, calm, connection to the earth, uplifting, oneness. I think I'm in good company here in terms of your connection. Shade, being rooted, brings happiness to the core, energizing, gives a sense of connection, inspiration for poems, beauty. So interesting, you're touching on some of the pathways, the 5 pathways to nature connections that we're going to talk about further on. So wonder, magical, so safety. Okay, so you can see that there's quite a variety of perspectives in terms of how trees support your health. I know for me, I can say a little bit about how I got into this work. When I was a teenager, I grew up in quite a very stressful family, like a lot of Irish teenagers. And there was no space in our house. There were 7 people in the house, and I was a very sensitive child, so I always needed my space, and I would have taken spent a lot of time in nature. But the nearest forest park we had was 25 kilometers away. So even when I was 14 or 15, I would hop on my bike and I would actually cycle 50 kilometers to the nearest forest park, just so I could really sit among the trees. I could sit by the lake. I could get some peace and quiet. So from an early age, trees really supported my health and well-being. And I would have seen that right throughout my social work career, when I was dealing with children with trauma histories, when I was working in cancer care with some patients towards end of life, when I was working in inpatient mental health settings, in terms of places in nature that they found were healing, were restorative. So trees have really supported me right throughout my life. So I'm just going to show you a little clip from Dr. Lee, who was really the key person that has developed the concept of forest bathing and forest therapy. So I'm just going to get that video up.
My name is Dr. Triin Lee. I'm a physician at the Nippon Medical School Hospital, and I'm the president of the Japanese Society of Forest Medicine. And I have studied the forest medicine at Shinrin-yoku for 30 years. Shinrin-yoku directly translates to the forest bathing. It is something spending time in forest to promote the good health. In fact, the Shinrin-yoku is originated in Japan in 1980s and as a national health program to help the stressed workers and to reduce their stress. Now, there are about 62 forest therapy bases across Japan, and those bases provide the service with the blood pressure check and some aromatherapy course, also some work with the forest therapy guide. All together get some beneficial effect from the forest bathing. Have long and fascinating roots into nature, especially into forest. 2/3 of the Japan are covered in forests. There are two major religions in Japan, Shinto and Buddhism. Both religions see forest as the realm of the divine. We even have the word karoshi, which means death for overwork. So it made sense for people to turn to forest to help. There are many beneficial effects on human health. For example, Shinrin-yoku can reduce blood pressure. Shinrin-yoku can reduce the stress hormone and stress situation. Shinrin-yoku also can reduce the blood sugar levels. The Shinrin-yoku can lift the depression. The Shinrin-yoku can improve the quality of sleep. The Shinrin-yoku also can boost your immune system, including the increase of natural killer cells and the activity of natural killer cells. Shinrin-yoku also can increase the anti-cancer proteins. The Shinrin-yoku can also improve the concentration and increase your memory. Yeah. You can visit a city park to enjoy Shinrin-yoku. In fact, in my research, 2 hours Shinrin-yoku in the city parks also can get many beneficial effects. Like Shinrin-yoku can improve your positive feelings and reduce your negative feelings. In my personal experience, I always visit a small park near my office almost every day during the lunchtime. So if you have a small park near your home or near your office, you also can enjoy the city park during your lunchtime. You also can put some plants or flower in your home or in your office to enjoy the indoor forest therapy. You also can produce some aroma by using the essential oil to produce some smell and to enjoy the sense of the smell of the indoor forest bathing. In this book, I show you how to practice Shinrin-yoku. I also show you lots of data on the benefits of Shinrin-yoku. So if you want to find health and happiness, please read my book, Shinrin-yoku.
Great. So I see you're saying very interesting benefits. Lovely video. Interesting, amazing video. Interesting how much he talks about smells. Amazing, very interesting. Thank you. Really interesting. Wonderful to have the data. Must buy the book. So fantastic. So apologies about the technology. Typical for me, I always love working out in nature. It's the technology that really stresses me out. Definitely, Vicky's definitely going to read the book. Fantastic. Okay, so let's just move on. Okay, so great. So again, we're going to have a little look about the definitions of what is forest bathing, what is forest therapy. So I suppose there's two main writers in the area. Dr. Lee is one, and also Miyazaki, another Japanese researcher. So the definition I've taken is from Miyazaki. So he talks about forest therapy involving taking in the forest atmosphere through the senses. So again, the 5 senses, engaging in mindful walks through the forest, breathing in the forest air, which contains phytoncides, which are an organic compound found in plants and trees, sitting and observing and developing an emotional connection to the forest. So again, it's quite a comprehensive definition. It's not the definition; it's a definition. So at the Forest Therapy Institute, where I work, the 2 definitions that we use, again, what we felt was that within the literature, the forest therapy and forest bathing were being used interchangeably. And for us, that really created a lot of confusion. The forest bathing movement has really been driven by media. So for us, we really wanted to separate out the definitions. So forest bathing for us is a health promoting, salutogenic nature connection practice that aims to enhance well-being, relieve stress, and encourage relaxation. So again, it's a health promoting, salutogenic as opposed to pathogenic, nature connection practice that aims to enhance well-being, relieve stress, and encourage relaxation. So what salutogenic means is it focuses on the positive benefits. So often in terms of health, we focus on disease, we focus on the negatives, and we don't focus on optimal health, the positive. I suppose it's like psychology. Positive psychology is focusing on, some of the happiness work. So salutogenic focuses on the positive aspects of health. So again, that's good. I can see the question. Ask any questions as like that, and then we can ask them at the end. So forest therapy for us at the Forest Therapy Institute is, I suppose, it's forest bathing operationalized as a nature-based intervention that targets specific mental health and physical health difficulties. So we see two levels in terms of this work. And internationally, there's a lot of debate because it's such a relatively new practice as to those definitions and terms. So I suppose forest bathing is a mindful, multisensorial, nature immersive experience. So people often say, "Oh, is it not just going for a walk? Is it a hike?" So it's a very different focus in terms of forest bathing, forest therapy work, because the whole area of work is focused on your connection to nature, on the nature connection pathways. It's very contemplative, it's very mindful, but it's different to the traditional mindfulness, that we're not just taking traditional mindfulness like the body scan or breath work outdoors into the forest setting. The whole premise for our work is to work with the senses, to work with the natural environment, to work with whatever is in front of us. So in terms of the forest therapy practice internationally, I suppose I've been involved in it for about 6 years now. I would see it as 1 tree, different branches. So in terms of Asia, as I said, it originated in Japan in the 1980s, but their work, Japan, Korea as a whole, forest welfare service, where they talk about cradle to grave in terms of forest interventions, from anything from forest kindergarten right up to forest burials, forest therapy, everything in between. But in terms of Asia, they're more focused in terms of the research is on the forest environment. So the type of forest you use, the type of trees, the temperature in the forest, the humidity, and how that impacts on your health. So, and also focus on a lot of breath work, Tai Chi in the forest, and physiological testing. So they would, with the forest therapy basis, They would do some testing. They would test people's blood pressure. They would test people's cortisol through their saliva before and after the forest therapy session, just to see the physiological benefits. So in terms of the US, it's more focused. That's where I did my training. It's more focused on the spiritual aspects of forest therapy. They see it more as a mini kind of medicine walk, rites of passage work. And they really focus on the partnership with the forest. So it's quite different than the focus in Japan. Also the language they use in terms of, they talk a lot about liminality, I suppose Jungian language, in terms of that we enter a liminal space when we enter the forest in a very kind of mindful, contemplative way. And then in terms of Europe, the focus of forest therapy is more on integrating it into the healthcare system, on the professional development of the practice. So, for example, I gave a talk last year in Switzerland on the forest as doctor, and I was absolutely blown away by the range of professionals in the room. We had everybody from health economists to psychiatrists, psychology. It was really to the health insurance companies. So the practice is really taken off. But in Europe, that's the whole idea, is to try and embed the practice into the healthcare systems. So whereabouts in Europe? I suppose there's a lot of work being done in Germany. They've recently got forest bathing covered on the healthcare system. A lot of work being done in Scandinavia, Sweden, and for, I suppose, Ireland, we've started some work here, but also it's really taken off in England as well. So also just to say, in Japan, there's also a concept of forest therapists. So they differentiate forest therapists as, I suppose, therapists, what they call doctors and nurses taking this practice outdoors. And I know in Switzerland they're looking at forest therapists as, psychotherapy outdoors. But for us, it's very different. It's a very different practice. Okay. So just in terms of the areas that we work in terms of our scope of practice, so we see forest bathing in the Forest Therapy Institute as working in the realm of health promotion and disease prevention. And in terms of forest therapy, working in the area of treatment, whether mental health treatment, whether physical health treatment, rehabilitation and recovery. So there are two different levels. So I know in some of the Scandinavian countries, in Sweden and Norway, they actually have forest clinics in the forest where they employ a range of staff to carry out some forest therapy interventions. So I suppose, what is forest bathing and forest therapy? So again, the whole concept of soaking up the healing benefits of nature. So opening your minds and senses. So when we work, we usually work with the five senses plus. So we work with the visual experiences in terms of patterns, shade, light in the forest, tactile experiences in terms of touching different textures, waters, temperatures, audio experiences in terms of soundscape in the forest. And soundscape is a really interesting area that we're going to look at a little further. Olfactory experiences, smelling. And again, what we know for people that come along, smelling can be very difficult for them. We almost have lost our sense of smell. So when we get them to really smell the forest floor, when we get them to smell different trees, it can be very interesting because it can bring them back memories from their childhood. Also, taste. We work with, we do a little bit of foraging, and we make tea with the plants in the forest, only when we know that they're safe, just so they can get the five senses experience. So the five different components that we work with are we use nature connection invitations. So that's basically the Forest Therapy Institute, where I'm one of the directors. We have developed this model that we call the 5x5 model. It's basically a model of 25 different elements that we use to design our interventions and what we use to design a forest bathing or forest therapy experience. So we would base any of our work on our 5x5 model, and we don't publicize it because we use it in our trainings. So that's where we train people on using the model. So also the mindfulness that we would use, obviously the concepts of mindfulness in terms of sensory awareness, in terms of being aware of the breath, the different sensations, but we would focus more on not about the thoughts that are coming up for people, but more on the connection to the natural world, that connection. We also use the expressive arts, and we'll go into that in a little bit more detail. Solo time, again, in terms of the interventions that we design, we would use solo time towards the end of the forest bathing or forest therapy session, just so people can integrate their experience. Sometimes they might do a little bit of reflective journaling at that point. And also circle work is a cornerstone of our practice. So that is different than group work. Circle work is basically based on the council work principles of speaking from the heart. One person speaks at a time, that there's no kind of censoring of what they're going to say. So it's a very respectful practice that's used in a lot of nature-based cultures. Okay, so yes, this was a picture from one of the trainings we did in Sweden last year. So we've trained people from 35 different countries, and she's really taking in the forest environment. So she's really connecting there through the sense of smell. So it's not just walking through the forest. It's really connecting on that sensory level. Slowing down. This is really interesting because when we get people to slow down, so one of the invitations we might give to to the group is really slow down and just watch what's moving around you. Everything from the forest floor right up to the sky. Really pay attention to what's moving around you, whether it's the trees are swaying, the grasses are moving, the insects are flying, the birds. But what we find is, especially if we're doing some work with corporations, that people can get really stressed when they slow down, and a lot of frustration can come up for people because they almost want a quick fix. So when we slow people down, we explain that these feelings are going to arise. So it's just another image from our training. Yes, so again, the focus is on, the concept of ease, I suppose, like the art of ease, which we've lost, relaxation, pleasure, and being. So we're focusing on the positive aspects of the experience. So the focus on inviting pleasure in from your senses, and just to slow down, that there's no pressure. There's no pressure to achieve any outcomes. You don't need to reach any goals. It's just to give yourself the space and allowing yourself just to be. Okay. So I suppose the concept of interdependency is really important because our work is all about relational. So it's really important that we're not just taking from the forest or we're taking from nature, but we're giving back in some way, whether that could be through reading a poem to the tree, through conservation practices, cleaning up the forest, donating money to charity, spreading awareness of the health benefits of the forest so that they're not going to be for sustainable forest management, so that they have alternatives to cutting down forests. So the whole concept of interdependency is really important. And again, this would be very kind of strong in terms of any eco-psychology work. So we often forget that we are nature, and nature is not something separate from us. So when we say we have lost our connection to nature, we have lost our connection to ourselves. So we were talking about the ecological self, where do we see ourselves basically in terms of our connection to nature. So maybe at that point, I might ask Niall. We have a couple of polls. So Niall, do you want to hear, or do you want to maybe put one of the polls up so we can, the first poll, which is, I think it's about what people's connection to nature is, what the strength of their nature connection is. Maybe we can put that up.
Shirley, 2 seconds.
Yeah, fantastic. So, oh, that's great. So now it's just out of that poll there, if you want to. Great. Great. Okay, so we have 28 people that are saying that their connection is very strong. 28%, sorry, 30 answers. We have 48% or 49%, their connection is strong. Medium is about 18%, 20 answers, and weak about 5%. So the predominant level of how they would rate your nature connection is strong. So thanks for that. Okay. So yeah, so just I suppose the focus on the work is around the sensory connection, working with water, feet, barefoot if possible, but that's not always practical or possible. But where we can, we get people to take off their shoes and walk on the forest floor for a little while if they can. Okay. So just in terms of forest medicine, I mentioned there's a lot of work that's been done around phytoncides. So what are phytoncides? So phytoncides are the antimicrobial volatile organic compounds emitted from plants and trees. So basically, these are chemicals that are given off by the trees if that they feel that they're under attack, maybe from insects, from strong winds, and they give off these chemicals that almost provide a balm for us to bathe in. So they're closely related to essential oils, but the difference is essential oils are extracted from the trees, whereas the phytoncides are just given off naturally themselves. They have physiological properties. They're antibacterial, antimicrobial, anti-inflammatory, as well as having calming effects. So there's a lot of benefits around these phytoncides. And this is a lot of the work that they're doing in Japan. So they know that that different tree species have different concentrations, different times of the year. They're stronger than others, and also different temperatures. So there's a lot of work being done in terms of the type of what are the best type of trees, for the phytoncides. So what we know is that a lot of the conifers, like cypress trees, like the pine, are quite strong in the phytoncides, but also in terms of the broadleafs, chestnut trees, beech trees, any large mature trees with a rich canopy, the phytoncides are quite strong. But also in terms of different times of the year, if you think about if you're in a forest where there's a lot of broadleaf, the trees might shed their leaves during the winter. So it's not as good for the phytoncides. So this is just a little quote from Robbie Louis Stevenson. So it's not so much for its beauty that the forest makes a claim upon men's hearts, as for that subtle something, the quality of air, that emanation from old trees that so wonderfully changes and renews a weary spirit. So again, what we know in terms of the forest environments are, there's something really about forests that are not planted, that they're not monocrop, that have such an impact in terms of psychological well-being. So also in terms of forest medicine, again, the type of forest is really important. We know there's a lot of work in terms of the microbes in the soil. I think it's the kind of fat in the bacteria that can have anti-inflammatory properties. Also negative ions, from waterfalls. There's a lot of research and done. When I was in Austria, there was some doctors presenting on work they were doing with patients, children with asthma near waterfalls, and how it was beneficial for their breathing, and that they're restorative environments. So also in terms of oxygen-rich clean air, I know we take that for granted, but a lot of our cities are really polluted. We've seen that since the COVID-19 crisis, the level of pollution that has reduced. Soundscape. This is a really important aspect of forest therapy, is what is the quality of our soundscape. I know where I live, we have like a train, we call it the Dart, that goes by every 10 or 15 minutes. And that really used to have an impact on me in terms of physiological arousal when I moved in first, but now I've habituated, I've gotten used to it. But often we are losing the quality of our natural soundscapes as air traffic gets busier. There's more cars on the road. Sunlight, of course, but also there's an optimal color mix in forests. The green can have a really restorative effect on people. And finally, in terms of forest medicine, fractal patterns. So what a fractal pattern is that it's naturally occurring in nature. So it's basically a design that keeps repeating itself. So like if you think about a shell, sometimes you can see the design that repeats itself, or branches on the trees or a leaf. And what we know is that when we gaze at these fractal patterns, it gives our brain a chance just to restore itself because we're familiar with it. It's a very natural response. So all that around forest medicine is in a book by Dr. Lee, who we saw at the start, called Forest Medicine. So maybe, Niall, I was going to ask you to share the nature therapy video just with the group. If you could share it from the beginning, just until 5 minutes, 30 seconds, just so you can get an experience of being in the forest. And simply as we are viewing the video, I'm just going to ask you two questions. So maybe one is, what are you noticing in terms of any sensations or emotions that are coming up? And also, if there's anything, any particular aspect of the video that you enjoy in terms of the forest type, or maybe we can just hear a little bit about that. So we'll get the video. So just some comments that are coming in for people is the moss, they could actually feel like they were there. They didn't want to see it end. Just the light coming through the trees, the bird song, very magnificent, so calming. So again, it's a really beautiful piece. We only saw 5 minutes of it, but you can imagine if you had that video showing in hospital, in doctors' waiting rooms, in prisons, in nursing homes. It's actually very powerful. So it's a little video called Nature Therapy, and it goes on for 30 minutes. But for me, it's really, really beautiful. Okay, great. So we're going to have a look at the 5 pathways to nature connection. So I don't know if you know Ryan Lumber's work in the University of Derby. There's a whole nature connections research unit there, which is doing absolutely fantastic work. Ryan is a psychologist, and he did his PhD on the 5 pathways to nature connection. So what he found was that people weren't connected and figures and the scientific names for the different species, but they were connecting to nature through a number of different pathways. And these are the 5 pathways that we would use in designing our interventions. So the senses, we've spoken a little bit about the 5 senses and how we can integrate it into a forest therapy session. Emotion, we'll have a little look at emotion, people's emotional connection to the landscape. What does the forest mean to them? What do trees mean to them? What does nature mean to them? Also compassion. So it's not about, again, just taking from the forest, but how do we get support from the natural world? But how can we give support to the natural world? So it's developing that compassion, that relational aspect. And meaning, the importance of meaning in people's lives. I think this is an area that comes up time and time again when I worked in an inpatient setting for people with serious mental health difficulties. That the lack of meaning in their life came up time and time again. And also beauty. How can we connect to nature with beauty? So I'm just going to read this little poem because, again, we incorporate nature poetry into the forest therapy experiences for people. And for me, this poem really encapsulates what the practice is about. And it's called For the Senses. And it's by the late John O'Donoghue, who was a philosopher, theologian, but he wrote a lot about conversations with the landscape. So may the touch of your skin register the beauty of the otherness that surrounds you. May your listening be attuned to the deeper silence where sound is honed to bring distance home. May the fragrance of a breeding meadow refresh your heart and remind you you are a child of the earth. And when you partake of food and drink, may your taste quicken to the gift and sweetness that flows from the earth. May your inner eye see through the surfaces and glean the real presence of everything that meets you. May your soul beautify the desire of your eyes, that you might glimpse the infinity that hides in the simple sights that seem worn to your usual eyes. Nature poetry can be quite powerful for people. Also, in terms of beauty, we would engage in eco art, expressive writing in nature. So meaning, again, a lot of our invitations, we use the word invitations because they're not, people have a choice whether to engage with them or not. So we invite them to engage. But in terms of meaning and metaphor in nature, it can be very powerful. Nature as a mirror. So just, again, a question for you in terms of the chat. So think about a special encounter you had with a tree. What was it like and how did it make you feel? So maybe just a couple of words that would come up for you in terms of maybe a tree that was really important in your life, is important in your life. how did it make you feel? Basically, that the encounter with a particular tree. Humbled, Holly, thank you. Connecting to something bigger, yeah. Again, nurtured, a sense of wonder, supported, free and adventurous, secure, grateful, protected, held, amazed, growth, rooted, safe, at peace, new start, childlike. Wow, it's amazing, isn't it? Isolated, again, of course, in our local park. It's a huge cedar tree. Struggled releasing emotions, hugged a tree, and it helped release the emotions for Vicky. Safe and protected, coming home. So again, if you think about it, trees are very important aspects of our lives. They're very symbolic. They really are embedded in our psyche. Soulmate. Yeah, thanks, Darren. And compassion. Again, this was a picture we took in Swedish training last year, where one of the participants literally merged in with the wall of moss. So just that deep relational connection. Circle work, as we said, again, we would offer people, just ask them, what are they noticing? What are they experiencing? And we do this in a very respectful way. Use of the expressive arts, as I was saying earlier, mindful movement. One of the very powerful invitations is move with the water. That can be very powerful for people who've experienced trauma in their body, any stuckness in their lives. Water can be very powerful, especially fast-flowing water. Expressive writing, making music from the forest, ritual, but also using scrolls. So we would give participants maybe a scroll with some words that we wrote on, like, how do you support the forest? How does the forest support you? So it's quite a reflective piece. So there's some of the scrolls we made. And you can see the beauty even, in that. It's a kind of a creative eco art. Again, it's really important to be respectful of the natural environment. But nature gives us so much. And also tea. We would usually end maybe a forest bathing session, a forest therapy session with tea that we have foraged from some of the plants in nature. We also train, when we train guides and practitioners, we train them in ethically harvesting of tea plants. So maybe, Niall, if you want to put up the second poll, maybe the poll with the question on what is your favorite landscape, that would be fantastic. And I'll just change the other presentation. So you can see Niall has put up the poll. It'd be interesting to see in terms of people's responses. City. Nobody's put city yet. I had to put in city because for some people that is their favorite landscape. So I think ocean and forest are coming in neck and neck. Interesting. So 35% forest, ocean. Yeah, forest, ocean, as you can see, are tied. Mountain third, and meadow fourth, and nobody had put in city. Okay, interesting. Okay, so we're just going to have a look at I'm going to briefly touch on the theories linking nature and well-being. Some of you, if you're used to nature-based practices, these theories would be very common to you. If you're not, it's no problem. So the first one really is the Biophilia Hypothesis. So these are the three main theories that come up in a lot of the research and the literature. Basically what the Biophilia Hypothesis states is that we have this innate biological connection that's evolutionary, and the more disconnected we are from our natural environment, the more psychological damage that it is doing to us. So it's almost like we're breaking the bond with Mother Earth or with ourselves. So a lot of research on the Biophilia Hypothesis. The second one, attention restoration theory, was developed, Kaplan and Kaplan. They're two psychologists, environmental psychologists. And basically what that theory is about is that, when we are stuck in front of screens, when we are stuck really directing our attention, we get cognitive fatigue. And because our attention is so directed, it exhausts us really. So when we're out in nature, it's more expansive. It's not as direct attention. It's more kind of effortless engagement. So they say that our cognitive capacities, I suppose, are restored, our attention is restored, and that even looking at, I think there's some research that even looking at a micro break, looking at a green roof for 40 seconds for some employees had a positive effect in terms of their performance. So that's a big theory, attention restoration theory. But also the importance there is about getting away from your day-to-day life. So there has to be a concept that, you're getting away from the mundanity, I suppose. And stress reduction theory, this is a theory that looked at the psychophysiological relaxation response to being in a built-up environment, surrounded by concrete, surrounded by cars, and then being in a more natural environment where they had a softer soundscape like a forest, and how people's stress levels really reduced. So these would be the main theories if you were interested in looking up further. Okay, so just in terms of stress reduction, a lot of the research focuses on the stress reduction capacities, I suppose, of being in a natural environment, being in a forested environment. So what we know is that the concept of nature therapy, I suppose, is that if we go into a forested environment, it can be known as a restorative environment because we're not being bombarded with the noise of traffic, pollution, some of those stressors on our bodies. And that can lead to physiological relaxation, which has a positive impact on the immune system functioning. So what we know of, is if we're going for a job interview, if we've got an exam, often we can get sick because our bodies are a little bit stressed and our immune system is weakened. So what they're saying in terms of the concept of nature therapy is that a lot of the benefits is on the stress reduction that can boost the immune system functioning. So it's a preventative medical effect. And what we know in terms of chronic stress is that it leads to mental health difficulties and physical health difficulties. So it's a really important aspect. So also there's a new concept called eco-psychosomatics. So it's evidence-based science of the biological as well as the psychological and sensoric impact of plants, animals, and ecosystems on the physical and mental health of human beings. So again, there's a lot of research being done in this area, in the area of environmental psychology, how different natural environments impact the bodies on different levels. So just in terms of the international evidence base, again, what we're finding in the research is that there's conceptual ambiguity regarding forest therapy in the literature. So again, some people would say forest therapy is green exercise. It's physical activity outdoors. Some of the research would say forest therapy is psychotherapy outdoors. So there's a confusion as to what exactly the definition is and what are they studying. So it's an emerging evidence base. Majority of the studies, the older studies, were in Japan and Korea, and there was a limited demographic, usually college students. So for me, there's a really important Forest Europe, which is it's the European body responsible for forest policy. They spent 4 years looking at the health benefits of forests. So for me, this is the most comprehensive study, in terms of the health benefits of forested environments. And I've put it in the end for the references. So they're saying that there's a strong evidence that forest visits have a positive impact on restoration and psychological well-being, improve mood and attention, and enhance psychological stress recovery. So that's very strong. That's what I say. And the strongest evidence is in the tension restoration and stress reduction. And there's substantial evidence of the potential benefits of contact with nature for avoiding health problems. So that would be around disease prevention. There's increasing evidence that visits to the forest environment can have a positive physiological effect, such as to lower blood pressure, reduce cortisol levels, and suppress sympathetic nervous activity. So again, in terms of those physiological effects, and forest visits can also reduce cardiovascular risk as a result of stress recovery. So again, the research in Europe is really only started over the last 10 to 15 years, but that is, for me, that would be a really important study. So these are just a couple of the relevant studies. So the health and well-being benefits of spending time in forest systematic review. They looked at 6 randomized control trials. And the conclusion was that forest therapy may play an important role in health promotion and disease prevention. However, the lack of high quality studies limits the strength of the results, rendering the evidence insufficient to establish clinical practice guidelines for its use. So more robust randomized control trials are warranted. So that's what we know, because it's really early days in terms of defining this practice. A lot of research needs to be done in this area. So this is another state-of-the-art review. It looked at 64 studies, and the conclusion was that longitudinal research conducted worldwide is needed to produce new evidence of the relationships associated with Shinrin-yoku and clinical therapeutic effects. So nature therapy as a health promoting method and potential universal health model is implicated for the reduction of reported modern day stress state and technostress. So again, it's saying the same thing, that more research needs to be done with specific populations. So just in terms of the gaps in the current research, very little information in relation to the intervention components. You know, I am always shocked at the level, the quality of the research. We were at a conference last year, in the World Conference on Forest and Public Health, and somebody presented on a forest therapy intervention they did for people in an inpatient unit with psychosis. But they couldn't tell us what they did apart from walk in the forest. So again, there is a frustration there that, people are doing so many different things in the forest. So how can you measure like with like? Limited research with specific populations. A lot of the research has been done with healthy male college students. Little description in relation to forest type in research. That's the other issue. People have a very different experience if you bring them into a forest that's all planted, monocrop, maybe pine, logpole pine, than a forest, an old, ancient, primeval forest that is very rare to find, but they have a very different experience. So limited lifespan approach, majority of research on healthy adults, and majority of studies are short-term with little follow-up. So in terms of future development, so if anyone is out there and is interested in researching in forest therapy, there's loads of potential. Longitudinal studies measure the impact over time, 6, 12-month, 2-year follow-ups. Randomized controlled trials, I suppose, is really hard. I mean, obviously we know randomized controlled trials are the gold standard, but the reality is every forest is different. You have to look at issues in terms of season, in terms of climate, in terms of humidity in the forest, type of forest, so soundscape. So it's very hard to control a lot of the variables, in this work. Greater cultural diversity needed in studies in terms of different cultural groups, from ethnic minorities, for example. Development of standardized and manualized interventions. So I suppose we have started that work in the Forest Therapy Institute in terms of we've designed a 6-week manualized intervention that we train our practitioners in. But again, it's very hard because You could have dogs in the space. The soundscape could be compromised. So even though you have a manualized intervention, you also have to work in partnership with nature. You also have to adapt and change to meet the environment. And also, there's no international consensus in relation to the definitions, but we're looking at that at the moment. So this is just a 6-week forest therapy feasibility study I did. That is just going to be published. I think the book is coming out in August, Forest and Public Health book. So it was a feasibility of a forest therapy intervention for adults who are experiencing stress in Ireland. So we were looking at a feasibility study because what we're hoping to do is maybe get some funding for a randomized controlled trial at some stage. So the study aim was to assess the feasibility of a 6-week forest therapy intervention for adults experiencing stress in urban Ireland through accessibility, practicality, and implementation. And we looked at limited efficacy testing in terms of stress levels, rumination, and well-being. In terms of the methodology, it was a mixed method design, so both quantitative and qualitative research methods. In terms of feasibility, we looked at focus group interview evaluation, outcome measure analysis, attendance rates, and process evaluation. And the inclusion criteria was people over 18 that were experiencing self-reported or occupational stress. So again, it was only a very small study. It was a feasibility study, but there's very few in terms of actual forest therapy interventions out there. So we thought it was important. The data collection and analysis. So we did the quantitative was a pre-post assessment of rumination. Because we were very interested, there was some research done in Stanford University by Bratman and al. On how rumination, the part of the brain responsible for kind of rumination, had everything had calmed down when people spent time in forested environments as opposed to urban environments. So we looked at rumination, we looked at stress and the well-being measures there. And in terms of the qualitative, we got people to write written reflections of their experience. So when they had the sit spot in the forest, they wrote their reflections. And we also had a focus group, which we did thematic analysis on. So basically, the intervention was 6 weeks, 6 consecutive weeks for 2 hours a week. We follow a standard walk structure. So the forest therapy experiences would go through specific they would follow a certain pattern in terms of connecting to self, connecting to place, awakening the senses, slowing down, some mindful engagement, some creative activities, some sit spot, circle work. So we have that kind of standard. And we used 3 different forests in Dublin and Wicklow. And the reason we wanted to use different forest types were some forests had water and some hadn't. So we wanted to see. So in terms of the quantitative, so we had 10 participants, all female, which is really interesting because we see that very common in our work in terms of people we train and people that come on forest bathing or forest therapy experiences or interventions. 7 completed all components. And we found statistically significant improvements on all the outcomes measured. So just in terms of the themes that came up for people, when we did the reflections, these are the themes that came up for people. So it really enhanced their level of connectedness, not only to themselves, but to others. They found the group support really important, but also to the forest. Just being, that there was no pressure for them to do anything. You know, they could take off their social masks. They could put away the pressure to do, and they could just be. their awareness really enhanced in terms of awareness they might have in terms of difficulties they were having in their life, getting greater clarity on issues. So what we know is when we are put into quieter soundscapes, we can get greater clarity because there's not so much competing, in terms of our kind of thoughts processing. And nature as healer, that they really experience the forest as a healing space. So the forest was their therapist. So that's the other thing to say, is that we work in partnership with the forest. The forest is the therapist. So in terms of the focus groups, again, connectedness came up. Also integration. So it was really important for us that we could see that people had started to integrate, daily nature experiences in their day-to-day life. So the concept of nearby nature, it's not okay just to bring people out to pristine forests, if it's not around their area. So we also work with a lot of urban forests, relaxation again, and support from the forest, support from others. So these are just some of the quotes that came up for some of the participants. When your mind has been full of activity and anxiety for 60 years, it is wonderful to find a peace-filled space. So by being still within this peace, the quiet has filled my mind. So really, really beautiful. So the feel of the wind and the raindrops feel soothing and take my attention away from pain and thoughts about the pain of other things. So again, the kind of sensory, we're focusing on the sensory can take the pressure off in terms of some of their psychological pain. So it's another one. So sometimes things in our life have to decay to allow new vibrant delights to unfold and exist. So nothing is ever wasted. Life begets life. So I definitely feel the connection to nature very healing because it's time out for myself. It slows me down, body and mind. I feel part of the forest, even though I don't live in it. And that's like being loved. So this was a really interesting theme that came up time and time again, was that people felt accepted by the forest. They didn't have pressure to perform. And often what we see is that the more stress people are under, the less able they are to really kind of engage at a high social level. So forest, that relationship, having a strong relationship can really be a protective factor. So emotional beside the water earlier, feelings of guilt and shame arising like the storm of water, washed into every crevice, and any stagnant water was shifted and washed out with fresh water. So yeah, a lot of the holdings in the body in terms of past traumas, water is very powerful for that. So I think this is the last quote. That's probably one of my favorites. Well, when I lie on the forest floor, I know nature will not judge me, abandon and forsake me, expect anything of me, just lets me be here, accepting me, allowing, showing my place in it all. So again, people had quite powerful experiences in nature. Some of them could be transcendental, kind of spiritual experiences of finding their place in the family of things. So who said that? It was actually one of my participants. She was a 60-year-old lady with chronic anxiety. So you can see how powerful, nature can be in terms of that relationship. So just a little in relation to forest therapy for mental health recovery. I worked for a number of years in a private inpatient hospital. We were very lucky that this was the hospital. You can see the picture on the right. It was absolutely beautiful design. They didn't realize it, but it was really based on biophilic design because, the rooms, a lot of them led to natural areas. So they may be all the rooms surrounded the courtyards where we had beautiful plants. I developed like a tree trail for them on in the hospital, where people could go and spend time with the different trees. But I used to just have a session once a week, forest therapy. People would usually be in there for maybe 6 to 8 weeks. A very kind of gentle sensory experience. So just in terms of qualities in the natural environment that contribute to good mental health, what we know, proximity to water is really important. Natural light. Again, if you think about your own workspace, or if you don't have a window, the impact that might have on you. Calming sounds of streams or waves. Again, if we can't get out into nature, like looking at those videos, can be very powerful. Clean with no pollution, and naturalness, no human impact. I think that is very hard nowadays to get the perfect space. That's the thing. You might have, like I have an absolutely beautiful forest I work in with the most amazing flowing river, rich diversity, looped trails, perfect. But it's so busy and everyone brings their dogs. So when you're working outside, these are the things you need to consider, unless you're working on private land, which is very rare to get. So in terms of the clinical applications to different mental health populations, so again, depends on who you're working with. If somebody in terms of the mental health continuum, mild, moderate, severe, the location, you need to look at the location and to make it as easy as possible for people to participate, to remove those barriers. The timing, what's the best time of the day for groups you will be working with? So for me, 11 o'clock during the day can be optimal in terms of people who might be on heavy medication. So some of the psychiatric medications, especially the antipsychotics, can dull the senses and lead to significant weight gain and difficulties engaging with the intervention. So just to be aware of that. And also mobility might be impaired. So I suppose we have to adapt, as forest therapy practitioners in terms of the language we use. So we use what we call the language of invitation. So there's an art to developing invitations, because you can really, really open up somebody's experience, or you can make it as narrow depending on the language that you use. So we really have to adapt it to the needs of the group. So the group dynamics, also, if any issues arise there. Sensory contact, sometimes touching nature might be uncomfortable for people. So we can't take it for granted that everyone is going to want to do the touch invitations. And it's really important that we normalize it for people so they don't feel that there's something wrong with them. Circle work, again, when we're working sometimes with different mental health populations, maybe chronic depression, that people don't want to share so much. They just want to go and just sit in the forest and relax. They don't want to be talking too much about their experiences sometimes. Biophobia, some people really have an aversion to natural environments. And risk management, you have to look at, if somebody has a history of psychosis, or if they are actively psychotic, is some of the invitations we do, is it suitable for them? Also, if there's suicidal ideation or suicide attempts, the area that you bring people, you have to really look at that. And also, like the use of sit spots. We don't use sit spots for people who has had a recent suicide attempt. Also, obsessive compulsive disorder. There could be a lot of phobias in terms of touching. So things to consider, when you're designing any intervention. So what are the people's level of nature connection? It might be quite low. Restoration or risk, have they had a negative experience in a forest? I mean, if you look at some of the films now in terms of a forest, a lot of forests are portrayed as the place where murders happen. Or in terms of people's cultural backgrounds, they might have had really difficult experiences in forests. Trauma history, again, when you're doing any of the kind of sensory work, or the kind of mindfulness, if somebody has a trauma history, they can get quite flooded quite quickly. So how do you manage that in terms of grounding? Landscape preference. Again, I asked you all had a different landscape preference, but also the people that you work with will have a different landscape preference. Personality. Sometimes people who are highly kind of perfectionistic, they struggle a little bit slowing down, getting down and dirty, basically. They might struggle with that a little bit. So these are the things that you need to take into consideration. So just in terms of forest therapy and mental health, we look at different areas. So stress vulnerability model, we talked a lot about stress earlier, that the more, if you have a genetic, there's a lot of genetic loading in your family in terms of if there's a strong mental health family history, the more stress you have in your life, the more likely you are to develop mental health difficulty. So that's why stress management is really important. Also around emotional regulation, when you are facing very strong emotions, is there anywhere in nature that helps soothe you? I know for me, it is by the sea. For others, it's in the mountains. So nature contact can help with emotional regulation. Also, the opportunities for social contact, which cannot be underestimated, especially around mental health. A sense of belonging and connectedness is really important for people. Also, the gentle physical activity. So the focus is not on the green exercise, but it's a byproduct of it. Also encourages emotional expression. Nature is amazing in terms of the creativity it invokes in people. Also, people have some experiences of awe and transcendental experiences where they really shift their perspective in terms of some of the real difficulties they're facing when they can see the bigger picture. And nature can be really powerful for that in terms of perspective. So that is really powerful work. Also, it reduces rumination, which we spoke about, the part of the brain that doesn't stop, that can lead to anxiety and depression. Gain perspective and clarity. Spoke a little bit about that. Improve sleep, and it's a supportive environment. So in terms of environments, it's really important that when people have a lot of demands on them in terms of their mental health, the more supportive the environment, the better. And forests can be very supportive because it doesn't put any demands on them. So there's really interesting research that I have on the slide at the end in terms of forest design for mental health promotion. So Stig's daughter she's a Swedish researcher, and she did some research in terms of 8 different types of spaces in natural and forested environments. So what she discovered was that some people like the more contained spaces. Some people like the more open vistas. Some people liked the more wilder spaces. So depending on their level of stress, different areas in the forest they were really attracted to. So you can have a look at this research if you're interested. But for us, that's the way we use it in forest therapy. We would try and have a forest where we have some more open spaces, whether there's more open views, more contained spaces. So just in terms of optimal forest therapy trails, again, there's a lot of research in this area. What we look for when we're working outdoors, and again, you're never going to get all this. So first of all, if you have a forest with a toilet, that's an absolute basic. But I know in Ireland, very few of our forests have public toilets. And when I asked the forest wheelchair forest service why, they said, oh, people would only vandalize them. But it's important if you're working with any population that you might have access to a toilet apart from Mother Nature. Also, when we do work, it's very rare, but sometimes you might get a forest where there's also an indoor workshop space site. So if it starts to rain too heavy, you can use the indoors as well. Looped trails, again, mixed woodland with rich biodiversity, because that's what the research shows are the most beneficial. So it's not just one type of tree, but you get different layers in the canopy, which can be magical. Presence of stream, waterfall, or natural soundscapes. Again, some of the forests I work in, they don't have running water, but they're very beautiful forests. So you're always kind of doing a balancing act. The more beautiful the forest, the busier it is. So well-maintained wide trails are few tripping hazards. I suppose in forests, sometimes that can't be prevented, but in terms of liability, we have to have our insurance. Open and contained spaces, so again, there's a difference of experience for people. And rest places along the trails, like benches, if possible. So just the last few slides before we come up to the questions and answers. So some of the challenges of taking the practice outdoors. So one, again, as I was saying, in terms of the privacy area, is these are things you need to consider. If you're working in a public space, you can't control who's going to be there. You could have a group of, like I had this beautiful, perfect space I was working in until I brought the group down. And there was 200 scouts on the river. So also liability insurance. You have to be covered working outdoors. The land use permits. You can't just go into a public forest. You need to have different land use permits to work there. Severe weather can be an issue. Allergies, pollen allergies. Presence of dogs can also be an issue for people, especially if they're anxious about them. Biophobia, again, just if they have fear of natural spaces or they don't like it. The unpredictability of the soundscape. Again, you have a beautiful forest, everything is lovely and quiet until somebody starts turning on the chainsaw, which you can't control for. So just in terms of the future for forest bathing, forest therapy, I think more research is needed in relation to the long-term effects of forest bathing and forest therapy in specific populations. Also, there's huge scope to design and evaluate specific forest therapy interventions right across the lifespan, from children, adolescents, adults, older adults. The forest bathing and forest therapy programs form part of sustainable forest management plans. There's a lot of work being done across Europe in relation to that they're trying to find different uses for forests instead of just timber production. Health sector and environmental sector working together, that's key. I know in Ireland that doesn't really happen. Doctors to prescribe nature-based interventions such as forest bathing and forest therapy under a social prescribing model. So again, I know some doctors have started to do that. Okay, so we might just finish just with one of the last polls, and then we can do questions and answers. So Niall, I'd be interested in just if you want to put the poll up about the length of time people spend in nature during the week, just to get a sense of it. Okay, so it seems to be kind of relatively equal across. The largest group is 24% tied on 2 to 4 hours or 6 to 8 hours. Okay, so it's relatively equal. Okay, so these are just some of the references, and I think you would have got the slides, so you can have a look at those. And there's my email address, and also I have 2 websites because I'm director of Eco Wellness Consulting, which is based in Ireland, and then the Forest Therapy Institute, which is based in Portugal, and it's more international work we do there. So thanks a million, everybody, for listening. And I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to be able to answer your questions.
All right, Shirley, for a very interesting presentation. I think everybody really enjoyed that. I'm just going to ask you some questions. Now we've picked some of the best that we've kind of assembled from everybody's questions. So the first one is there any research about the differences between therapy in nature and therapy that doesn't happen in nature, like just in a standard setting? Is there any research comparing the differences between the two, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so I'm not aware. And I suppose my question would it be kind of psychotherapy outdoors in a natural setting versus psychotherapy indoors? Or would it be psychotherapy indoors versus forest therapy outdoors? So I suppose that would be kind of my question. Are you just, I'm not aware of any research, but it would be easy to measure if it was taking psychotherapy practice into a forest setting, because there would be less variables. But I'm not aware of any specific research.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, the next one's from Carl, and Carl has asked, can we have more information on trauma and healing with forest therapy? Are there any links, books, or articles? How specifically would you work with someone with trauma with your skill set?
Sure. So what I could do after, I could put up I could send you a couple of links to articles, Niall, and maybe you can disseminate in terms of that. So I suppose really important that you're skilled in kind of grounding techniques, because people can be quite flooded when they go into a forest environment in terms of all the sensory overload. So first of all, I suppose in terms of your assessment, you'd have to be aware if somebody has a trauma history, if it's specific to a natural landscape, or it could be something like, past sexual abuse. You have to be aware of some of the sensory issues, because I know sometimes working with your hands in terms of the soil, some of the water invitations, you might want to modify. So that would be my suggestion, to find out a little bit about their trauma experience, to see if they have a good relationship with nature, to see, do they have any fear of working in natural spaces? That's the other thing. Sometimes you might want to start somewhere like a park, and then gradually, it's almost like a scaffolding, trauma, move towards a forest. Sometimes it could be as simple as getting them to watch a video of a forest, then move into a park, then a forest. So kind of building it up there.
100%. Okay, so the next question is from Jean, and Jean has asked, what are your thoughts on the efficacy of the current environmental and nature education in schools in creating children that are both connected to nature and have pro-nature / environmental behaviours?
So I suppose I just kind of know the Irish context, and what I would really love to see is if they did some work integrating the 5 nature connection pathways that's been developed in the University of Derby, because a number of environmental organisations like I think Natural England, different nature trusts are using it. So for me, that the relational aspect of the environment is left out with some of the environmental education. And the reality is we don't protect what we don't know and love. So for me, I would like to see the 5 pathways of beauty, emotion, meaning, compassion, and the senses being integrated into any program.
Very interesting. Okay, so we've got one here from Nigel Jackson, and Nigel has asked, is there any evidence supporting scientific belief in chi or ki and increased levels of chi or ki being observed after forest bathing?
So what I would say is you could maybe look to some of the Japanese research. We in the Forest Therapy Institute don't use Qigong or Tai Chi in our interventions, but I know it would be the cornerstone of a lot of the Japanese programs. So maybe you could check out and see. I'm not aware of any Japanese studies, but you could check out the Forest Therapy Japanese studies for that.
Okay. Vicky has asked, what are the biggest hurdles to implementing some of this into mainstream outdoors education and schools?
Yeah. Well, I think, first of all, it's about, do they understand the benefits of it? I know in terms of systems, sometimes it's very hard to change systems. I know in Ireland, I've presented in a number of schools, but they really were interested in this area. So I think sometimes it's down to the personality of the school principal and the school boards that they're passionate about it. But But the reality is, what we know is that children are becoming disconnected from nature. What we've seen recently, especially in the media, is that a lot of the natural environments are getting destroyed with littering, the respect really is gone. They're not seeing the natural environments as something that's part of them, something that's beneficial. So I think the hurdles would be maybe just to show them the evidence around the nature connection pathways, how a stronger connection to nature can lead to more pro-environmental behaviours.
100%, that makes a lot of sense. And this is actually very related, but Stacey has asked, how does this apply to working with children, specifically for treating child trauma? Stacey is a home educator and has noticed that many of her clients are carrying a huge amount of school-based trauma and stress that has led to the decision to home educate.
Yeah. I mean, Stacey, this is an area that I'm really interested in. I worked in child protection and child mental health for about 10 years, and I would have experienced a lot of childhood trauma. And what we've seen in terms of the nature work, how powerful it is, because some of the children have difficulty in forming attachments, to adults or to caregivers, and their home is not a safe place for them. It's highly stressful for them. So if they have a place in nature that they go to, that they have a bond with, a special place, that can really be a protective factor for them. So I think there's huge scope. There's a really interesting book called The Healing Forests. So it's The Healing Forests, and it was written by an Israeli nature therapist, and he wrote about nature therapy, the expressive arts, and working with children and trauma. So, Stacey, you might want to check that book out, because he's actually adapted a program. I think it was like a school program, a 12-week program to work with children. So for me, there's huge scope in the area of working with children and nature, and it's really needed. So even something simple like, knowing where the nearby nature spaces are. I know young children can't go there by themselves, but as they get older, they might have a special park they go to. They might have a special tree they have a relationship with. They might have a special, stone or whatever, but that can really help build their resilience.
Cool. Okay, so the next one is from Margaret, and she's asked, what do you think of gardening as a form of therapy? And is it another potential route into forest therapy?
Yeah, so if you look at any of the research on kind of nature-based interventions, Natural England actually have produced a really interesting publication called Nature-Based Interventions for Mental Health, and gardening therapy or horticulture therapy was one of the interventions they looked at. So it's actually quite easy to measure the benefits, of horticulture therapy or gardening therapy. So I would see it's a different form. It's a different kind of therapeutic intervention, but it's equally as beneficial. But also it can be more accessible to people. So I know the inpatient unit where I worked, the occupational therapist used to do a lot of gardening therapy with the inpatients. So there would be a strong evidence base.
Cool. Okay, the next one's from Patrick, and Patrick's asked, can you provide any examples of UK or Irish organisations facilitating access to forest bathing for inner city dwellers, particularly people from ethnic minorities?
Ireland, no, because we're still very early days. I mean, there's a lot of projects in relation to maybe forest bathing in terms of mental health populations, but in terms of ethnic minorities, no. I'm not sure about England. I know we've trained some psychotherapists from Mind, the mental health charity that work. They're London-based, and they do a lot of forest therapy work over there. I'm not sure if they do it in the inner cities. Yeah.
Okay, no problem. The next one's from Jenny. Jenny says, I read something about hugging trees giving us a boost, and especially during lockdown for those of us who live on our own and have limited contact with others. Are you aware of any information about this?
Yeah, so I suppose we would always try and not stay away from the hugging tree concept, because there are some really kind of therapeutic benefits to it. but we wouldn't say, forest bathing is just tree hugging. What we know is there's some work in terms of the therapeutic landscapes about the electromagnetic fields. One of our we have a local institute in Italy, and we have some researchers there, and they're looking at how different trees give off different electromagnetic fields that impact different organs in the body. But for me, the evidence is not strong enough there, and I don't know enough about it.
Okay, no problem. The next one is from Kate, and Kate has asked, is it possible to learn forest bathing remotely, considering the stress people are under at this time, especially the NHS and other workers and volunteers, and it's harder to meet up for sessions in person?
Yeah. So again, I know some of our, first of all, in terms of our training, they would be on site. We know some other training organizations, just say in the States, they've put all their training online. We are very reluctant to do that until we absolutely have to. But a lot of our guides would provide virtual forest bathing experiences during COVID, where they go out into the forest themselves and they give different invitations from the forest. I've done some different podcasts on a kind of virtual forest bathing experience for different companies, corporations. So it's a really interesting question in terms of technology. Where does technology and nature meet? And for me, they have to meet somewhere in the middle, because that's the reality of the world we live in, especially for the younger people. I think the research shows that obviously the best impacts on your health are the real sensory experiences, but virtual experiences also have some benefits. So yeah.
Fantastic. Kate has also asked, are there forest therapists in the UK as well as in Ireland?
Yeah, so we trained, I before we set up the Forest Therapy Institute, I trained for an American association. We would have trained forest therapy guides in all over England, based, I think we were down in Devon. So yes, there is, but there's no network. I mean, that's what needs to happen, in each country, because the practice is so new. I'd say maybe there could be 50 forest therapy practitioners or guides trained in the UK, but they haven't come together to form a network. We're starting that process in Ireland. We're starting the Irish Association Forest Bathing and Forest Therapy to promote the practice, develop policies and guidelines, but that hasn't happened yet in England.
Well, for anybody listening to this that's interested in doing that, I think that's be a good project to work on, for sure, around England. The next question is, do you need to have a background as a psychologist or a psychotherapist to train as a forest therapist?
So I'll just explain the different levels. Okay, so we see 3 different levels. So one is the forest bathing guide that works in health promotion, eco-wellness, ecotourism. So that's kind of open to everyone. The second level that we train in is what we call is a forest therapy practitioner. So most people we train there would have social care, social work, mental health or psychological background, but not necessarily. So what we say is if they want to work with people maybe with mild mental health difficulties, they have to do the mental health first aid training first. And we've actually partnered with Mind, to offer that. The third level that we don't train is forest therapists, and they train in Japan, and it's basically psychotherapy outdoors. So that would be, you would have to be a psychotherapist or a psychologist, psychiatrist to practice on that level.
Right, okay. Holly has asked, do you have your own podcast, Shirley?
I've just started learning the art of podcasts because I've been asked to do it for some organizations. So not yet. I mean, I've done private ones, but I'm developing. I've done a number of different radio interviews and stuff, but I probably will be doing them in the next month or so.
Well, if you get that launched, make sure to send it to me and we'll share it with our audience. Nikki has asked, is wild swimming a part of this practice?
It's not a part for us, which is interesting because if you think of the word forest bathing, you think that you're actually going to go swimming. So for us, it's about bathing your senses. We don't integrate wild swimming. but some other guides might. So.
Okay. Jean has asked, can you please say more about the movement of water and trauma healing? Do you have any links or info that people can check out?
Again, I can have a look and send something on. I mean, offhand, I don't, but I'm sure there is stuff out there. I mean, that's what I've seen the strongest in terms of my own practice over the years, how water is one of the most restorative elements. And again, it depends on the type of water body. It depends on how fast the water is moving, all that. So I can have a look and maybe send something on.
Okay, cool. I think we've got one more question. Peter has asked, how does this all differ between summer and winter?
Yeah, really interesting. So again, in terms of, if you think about kind of the pure definition from Japan around the forest bathing or forest medicine, a lot of it is focused on the chemicals that are released from the trees, the phytoncides. So in winter, they wouldn't be as active. But there's many other benefits. What we know is that getting people out into natural light during the winter can be really important for some people because they spend so much time indoors. So what we have to do is we have to adapt the timing we go out for. In the summer, we go out for a 3-hour session. In the winter, we go out for a 2-hour session. People get really slow or cold when they slow down. I mean, it's really interesting. One of my very first experiences, I brought a group of instructors, and they were frozen. They got cold after the first hour because we had slowed down so much. So the reality is that you really have to know the environment you're working in. Once people's bodies get so cold, it shuts down, and it's not a pleasurable experience. So I would say, yes, the different seasons have an impact, but they have different benefits.
Cool. Okay. Sharon has asked about, I don't know if this is appropriate to ask, but I'll ask it anyway. Can you please give us an idea of the cost of training for your forest therapy practitioner course?
Yeah, so the forest therapy practitioner, I think it's around €900, and it's a 4-day training and 3 months of mentored practice.
Okay, cool. Well, Shirley, this has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for doing this for us. I really appreciate it. Have you got anywhere you'd like to send anybody before we round off here?
Just thanks so much for the engagement. It was really great. The chat really made it helpful because I didn't feel like I was by myself, and really appreciate you bearing with me in terms of the technological issues, which can be quite stressful. So really, really appreciate it. And I hope that they can email me as well. My email is there. If there's anything that you want to know, just send me an email, and might take a couple of days to get back to you, but I will get back to you. And just thanks to you, Niall, to give me this opportunity as well. I've really enjoyed this morning.
No problem at all. Okay, everyone, we're back here at 1:00 for a talk on the psychology of climate change as well. So thanks again, Shirley, and we'll see you guys soon. All right.
Great. Thanks, Dan. Bye.